My technique for that is primarily to imagine that my worst enemy is sitting next to me, scanning pretty much every single sentence I write and every sentence that I utter that comes out of my mouth, and applying the most ferocious scrutiny technique to it that you could possibly think of. So as long as I have that in mind, as long as I'm basically thinking what could be mangled out of this by the person who wishes me the most ill in the world, then I'll tend to check everything just about well enough to not get myself in trouble later. A lot of that really depends on what happens to the Conservative Party if they enter opposition. Like the initial signs of what we've seen, for instance, at the party conferences this year, for instance, what we've seen at various festivals on the right, has been a real push into the further realms of culture war and quite vitriolic rhetoric around issues like race and immigration and gender. If that process continues to incubate in opposition, you'll find that political debate is going to be really quite fractious and vicious, even over the next few years. What will change is the government's likely to become much, much more stable. So you'll tend to see prime ministers, for instance, Prime Minister Keir Starmer, sticking around for a good 5 years without this kind of clown car merry-go-round that we've seen of a prime minister replacing the next prime minister for 12 months at a time. So government, probably a little bit more stable, but the kind of rhetoric around our political discussions could well end up being even more vicious than what we've been seeing for the last few years. How do we combat fake news? I mean, the key to a lot of that, I have to say, lies with readers. Like, you have to look for the quality of the thing that you are looking at. You have to see whether someone has the expertise in order to be able to talk authoritatively about it, whether they presented any kind of empirical evidence. Have they linked out somewhere? Have they included footnotes? If you're reading a newspaper article, it's good to check if there's 2 names, 2 bylines at the top of it, to make sure that there's someone in Westminster, yes, but there's also a subject area specialist back in the newsroom who's been trying to put all of the information together. There are things that we can fix as an industry, but ultimately you cannot fix media, you cannot get rid of fake news unless readers are also educating themselves about the way that they consume it. Populism is the view that the people are one single homogeneous mass and they are constantly betrayed by a shadowy, secretive elite. It's false in every aspect, but it is loved by leaders because it gives them a kind of laundering system to make sure that they're never really held responsible for the things that they do wrong. They can just blame that on the shadowy elite or the blob or the establishment and make sure that they're really never held to account for their own actions. It's a very tempting drug for politicians, but it's not a drug that tends to work very well in this country. We've had a moment of being racked by it, but generally speaking, it doesn't really succeed. And that, unfortunately, is what the government's discovering now.